We need to talk about the very, very likely possibilities for how the war is going to progress. We need to bite some reality. We need to just take it, and we need to stop beating around the bush. The Russians are almost certainly going to continue the war. Negotiations are almost certainly going to fail. And if they succeed, the likely success will be their lack of collapse, i.e. not the collapse of a successful ceasefire, not the collapse of a successful peace deal. Ceasefires have already fallen over like 5, 10, 20 times. Like, the ceasefires are not working. You look at Ukrainian cities, they're being hit by drones. Ukrainian energy infrastructure has been hit. Russian energy infrastructure has been hit in response. A lot of the civilian ceasefire, the White House announced civilian infrastructure ceasefire, there was never even an attempt on the Russian side to acknowledge that that was even made. So the ceasefires are not working. But the most likely chance of success these ceasefires have is getting dragged out, which isn't success. These aren't, like, the negotiations being dragged out isn't successful if the war continues. Because if you look at the areas, the actual quote-unquote ceasefires haven't concentrated so far, where? The Black Sea. Oh, you mean where the Russian Navy already lost 50% of the Russian Black Sea fleet? They lost to Moscow, they lost this, they lost that. Okay, well, I mean, they broke the blockade themselves, the Ukrainians. I don't really know how much this really benefits in saving lives. And that's what Trump said he wanted to do. He said he wanted to save lives. How many lives does it save? I guess some sailors, I guess. But in the grand scheme of things, how many people are dying on the waves every day? I really couldn't give you the number. But it's like less than 1/1000th of what's falling on the front line on the ground every day. And then it's the long-range energy ceasefire. Now, it was supposed to be energy and civilian, but again, what the Russians keep doing is they announce one thing, right? They announce, the Americans announce it's going to be an energy and civilian ceasefire. Russians only acknowledge a energy ceasefire that will only be respected upon XYZ new terms, which keep changing. We just saw that happen again as they were trying to do more ceasefire talks with new terms that had to do with, new elections in Ukraine and, no more aid being sent to Ukraine from anybody, and then we'll recognize a ceasefire. And, then you have to do this, you have to do that. Well, the Ukrainians accepted it unconditionally. Even though for the entirety of the time on the campaign trail, Donald Trump had built up the pressure to be able to pressure the Ukrainians. He normalized it in his base. And lo and behold, the big problem was that the Russians were not really to concede all that much. Who would have thought? Not a big surprise. They didn't want to concede much. In fact, it's not only that they don't want to concede, they're making new demands. As in, not new demands as in hey, these are demands they haven't voiced before. They've been saying it all the time. If you just paid attention, you would hear them saying, we still want Kherson. We still want Zaporizhia. We still want these cities. And now it looks like that they're preparing for offensives to try to take these cities, to try to take the rest of the Donetsk region. Now, I don't know if it's going to be direct. In fact, when we talk about cities like Kherson, I think a direct assault by the Russians would be probably a disaster. And I'm not saying 100% a disaster, but a river crossing for the Russian army across Kherson, there's a reason why they pushed across the river the last time. That could be a disaster for the Russian army, and who knows how much time it would take for them to recover. And that would mean like more time for them to, lose their eye on the ball, lose troops, lose support for the war at home, let the pressure on the economy build up. So maybe not the river. Maybe they won't attack these cities directly. But my big fear, and the fear of some others of my colleagues, is that they'll try to attack, and we've heard recent reports of this, and we've heard these warnings from the presidency, from Zelensky, of offensives into Sumy, of offensives into Kharkiv, to try to take places like Kupiansk, to try to take more land around Volchansk or Lipsy, or land around Sumy, which are areas that are directly on the border with Russia. If you look at these places, they have an interconnected highway system with Russia. They can cross over the border and attack. The supply lines are short. The places where the Russians have the shortest supply lines are the areas that they've had the most success advancing. Not always, but I mean, it certainly has helped the Russians. And so there's a possibility that instead of the trading of, Ukrainian holdings of Russian territory in Kursk, which is what we were talking about during the Biden administration. Now we're talking about, or at least I would think the Russians are thinking about, crossing into Sumy and into Kharkiv deeper, taking territory, and maybe trading that for control of Kherson and control of Zaporizhia. Because when you think about the city of Kherson, what this would matter for the Russians is, I mean, this would get them across the river. That would mean they would have a river crossing without any military fight. And so that would give them time during a ceasefire to build up defenses, possibly a peace deal that breaks later to build up, so that if a future war happens with the Ukrainians, they don't have to cross the Dnieper. That's no longer an issue. They can march straight into Mykolaiv and then up towards Kiev, down both south from Belarus, up north from the south. So it would get rid of one of Ukraine's best natural defenses, as well as taking the territory that they had announced the annexation of, which also includes Zaporizhia, which is why I include Zaporizhia, because they have not dropped that as a demand. This would also mean we're going from Russia controlling like 20% or like 19 to 20% of Ukraine's territory to something like 25 to more. We're going much further. We're talking about Ukraine losing over a fourth of their country. So, I mean, I don't want to say that they'd be turned into a complete rump state, because what would still exist, but it would weaken the state, certainly. And the possibility of a bad deal could also mean that future investment in the country, people returning home from abroad, I mean, that decreases the likelihood, which would make it even more difficult for Ukraine to stand up in a future war as Russia consolidates with what they've gained. Either way, point is, the Russians very well have motivations to conduct future offensives to try to take more territory. So they can say, look, we annexed everything, that we have control of everything we announced the annexations of. We're going to, trade for the rest of the Donetsk region, or continue to do offensives in the Donetsk region. That's another area they could do offensives in. The fighting around Pokrovsk, the Russians have been losing some land around Pokrovsk recently, but they could still try to take the city. I filmed a lot there. The Russians do want to take it. They want to take the rest of the Donetsk region. And so they could well try to push forward in the Donetsk region, push maybe a new offensive in Sumy, new offensive in Kharkiv, trade for land. But all of this indicates, and this is all speculation, but I think this is very, plausible scenarios. What I'm trying to get across with all this speculation is that the Russians have motivation. They have motivation to push forward. Now, that's unquestionable, I think, from so many years of war. But I think it's also clear from the fact that they're continuing to espouse these demands for Kherson and Zaporizhia. And we've even heard some reports to Western outlets from Russian officials, anonymous Russian officials, mind you, talking about the possibility of land-for-land transfers. Now, exactly what land would be traded might not always be clear, but Sumy, Kharkiv, these border regions where Russia could have short supply lines, cross over, take a little land here, take a little land there, and where Ukraine wouldn't want to have like the regions cut up and like slightly divided, that could be the strategy. Now, they have a motivation, there's a strategy, but do they have a means? Well, they're preparing one. Russia is preparing a new offensive, according to AP, according to the Ukrainian government, according to diplomatic sources and Ukrainian analysts. But the Russians are also preparing with more men. They're not just preparing the men they already have with, getting the troops in locations and moving the guns in locations. They're preparing the largest conscription campaign in 14 years. Not for the entirety of the war, in 14 years. Meaning, basically before the Russians first invaded Ukraine back in 2014. So not only the entirety of the big war, the entirety of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 160,000 men. 160,000 men. Now look, these men, the people being conscripted, in the future, they could be sent to the front line depending on the war powers that Putin decides to grab upon, but that will come with backlash, and he knows it, and it's part of the reason why he hasn't done it, because the only time that Putin's approval rating has really taken a solid hit was when he tried to engage in some form of mobilization. So I think that there's something holding him back from that. So the 160,000 men would not directly go to the front, but you know how it could work? 160,000 men are conscripted so they can make up positions maybe on the Finnish border or with other European borders, where right now the Russians have had to pull back a lot of support so they can deal with other crises and maneuver troops around so that certain volunteer soldiers, others who are more contract soldiers, sign contracts for big money deals, instead of them having to do border patrol, the conscripts can do border patrol. More conscripts can do border patrol because they got a big border with Ukraine, and more conscripts, more contract soldiers, more volunteer soldiers can be sent to the front to continue with advances. Basically, it could free up more manpower for future offensives, even if these troops don't directly go to the front line, because they free up other people to go to the front line, as well as getting Putin more men to man border posts with Europe. Because right now they've pulled back a lot of manpower from the Finnish border to try to make up the difference. Putin is preparing for negotiations to fail. We're hearing this as reports from Russian officials of the possibility of new offensives to try to get a better negotiating position. We're getting reports from AP. We're getting reports from the Ukrainian government, and they're even saying, Sumy and Kharkiv as likely targets. And I think it makes sense, as we've previously discussed. And they've already have troops deployed in Kharkiv. And now with, Ukraine pushed out of Kursk, they could keep going into Sumy. They already have some troops in place. They were the troops that were pushing them in Kursk. Pushing the Ukrainians out in Kursk. So the possibility of the Russians continuing the war at this point is the unquestionable likely outcome. Unquestionable likely outcome. It was the likely outcome before, but now it's the outcome that all seems but certain. Now, maybe something changes, and I hope something does. Maybe that 10% chance, that 15% chance, if I'm being generous, okay, that, the right contra code is hit, or they make the Ukrainians concede just enough somehow, while not enough that the government collapses. Who knows? Maybe they do it. But the way the Russians have engaged in negotiations by rejecting a unilateral ceasefire, the way they've engaged with the ceasefires by breaking them immediately after making them, the way that they've engaged with negotiations by saying one thing in negotiations, agreeing to civilian ceasefires on civilian infrastructure, going out in public, and then not announcing the same thing, the way they've engaged in old Soviet-style negotiating tactics like Molotov used to do, just restating the position over and over and over. And as Washington backs off on NATO membership, as Washington backs off on American troops in Ukraine, as Washington undercut aid, both intelligence sharing, which costs nothing, and continued military aid, as Washington kept Ukraine away from the table, which before, during the Biden administration, during the last team, for good reason, I think, by the way, they said that was non-negotiable, that Ukraine would be at the table and America would back them up to add to the leverage in the negotiating position. That was tough negotiating. That's why the Russians didn't like it. That's why they're a little bit more pleased with how things are going right now, which is terms being given up. For example, possible sanctions relief on the agricultural industry. And now the American government talks about one thing, the Russians now come out, okay, now we need to talk about swift sanctions relief. We need to talk about agricultural imports, which could mean not only goods going into the agricultural industry and more money flowing into Russia, which would mean, more money into the war machine while the war is going on, by the way. But hell, under certain agricultural imports, you can get agricultural drones that you 100% could turn into dual-use military drones. You want to know why? Because I've seen it done. I've been on the training grounds watching agricultural drones that are supposed to drop seeds, drop T-62 tank mines, TM-62 tank mines that have been retrofitted to act like gigantic explosive devices to tear apart your trench. And so if the Ukrainians can do it, and I'm not saying this to say the Ukrainians don't have some ingenuity about them, but the Russians, they adapt very quickly. The Russians can do it, and the Russians have done it. So, under these demands, the Russians could literally be importing weapons under American sanction policy, under the way that they're maneuvering, and we have yet to get any concession out of the Russians. While the Ukrainians agree to a unilateral ceasefire, no conditions about NATO membership, no conditions about anything. And Zelensky rolled the dice and said, you know what? I don't even think he'll accept it. And you want to know what? He was right. He was right. And you want to know what Zelensky said at the table negotiating with J.D. Vance and Trump about the 25 times Putin violated the ceasefire? What happened when the ceasefires were signed? They were violated. And I'm not even saying that it's impossible to make Trump, I mean, Freudian slip, to make Putin respect the ceasefire. It's just the way you do it is not by just trying to be his friend or conceding over and over, because then he just thinks, how much more can I squeeze this man out for until it's going to be bleeding a rock? And as this is going on and they're dragging their feet, they're building up. And what is our administration doing in the meantime? What is our administration doing? Are we ramping up sending of excavators? Are we ramping up sending of aid to add pressure? No, we're reeling back. We're reeling back when it comes to things that support the front line, but also things that support morale in Ukraine. For example, trying to help teams discover the kidnapped Ukrainian children. We cut off the funds for that, and only due to public backlash did they temporarily restore the funds, not even to continue the program, just so they could get the files that were already created. Meaning that the team at Yale that was working on this to help get all these kids, they lost access to the files because of how the funding was cut. Because again, they did it with no care. All of this is done with a chainsaw, just like Elon said. And so they were just stuck without all that work that they did trying to recover all these kidnapped Ukrainian kids. Now that has been temporarily restored because the backlash was too strong, to show you that there is real backlash on the issue of Ukraine that can have effect on the administration. But I mean, this is not building pressure on the Russians. What pressure has been built on the Russians? At the start of the administration, he said sanctions. Since then, the Russians have bombed civilian infrastructure. They've bombed energy infrastructure. They've violated ceasefires. They've dragged their feet. They've rejected Donald Trump's ceasefire deals. Donald Trump said that the war would be over before he was in office. Then he said it would be done within 24 hours. And then he said it would be done within 100 days. And now we're going to pass the 100-day mark. At what point does he add pressure? As this is happening, you need to prepare the Ukrainians in tandem. Remember, one of the preconditions that the Russians put forward for accepting a ceasefire deal is that the Ukrainians can't mobilize any more men. They're mobilizing 160,000. They're drafting 160,000 men into the Russian armed forces. 160,000 men they can draft. But when it comes to, the Ukrainians, they're not allowed to mobilize these men. They're allowed to, the Russians are allowed to bring in North Korean soldiers. The Ukrainians can't, in order to have a ceasefire, to undercut their position. Because that means once negotiations finish and they fail, the Ukrainians, their main issue is manpower, and they wouldn't have been addressing it during the ceasefire. But what will the Russians be doing? Drafting, bringing in North Koreans. As the aid is cut off to Ukraine, what will the Russians be doing? Continuing to produce tons of weapons. As the sanctions relief comes, import CNC machines and what's necessary for their industry, and continue to take North Korean soldiers and North Korean weapons. And when you consider that some reports indicate the North Korean shells could make up like 30 to 50% at the highest estimates of Russian shell output, as in the shells are firing on the battlefield, that's significant. But that wasn't offered to be cut. Hell, the Trump administration didn't even ask if that was a possibility because they knew it wouldn't be. Which indicates what? That every single avenue of negotiation the Russians are aiming towards, or avenues where at the other end of it, if negotiations fail, the Ukrainians are weaker. Even the ceasefires they've agreed to have been strategic, just like, for example, the Black Sea ceasefire was strategic. The energy ceasefire is strategic. The Ukrainians are building more long-range strike drones this year at the rate that they're producing them right now, at the rate we were reading about the reports and how they were hitting Russian. I mean, from the Russians, reports that they're producing, saying 100 drones hitting them a day on certain days. Much more than before. And from the Ukrainian government numbers, they would be producing more drones this year than the rest of the war combined. And that being used to target Russian oil refineries, that has economic pressure. That puts real pressure on the Russian economy. And another year of that, if they're going to continue the war, would suck. It would suck for the Russian economy. And there's also always the possibility that come 2026, as we're hearing a lot of Russian analysts say, oh, maybe the war doesn't even end in 2025. And we're starting to hear the normalization of certain Russian officials talk about the war not ending in 2025. If you remove that pressure the Ukrainians can build, the one way they have left, if they don't have the manpower to make incursions into Russia in order to build pressure on Russia, is taken off the table. They're not allowed to do it. Right as spring comes around, the time of the year where strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure cause the least suffering on the Ukrainian population. Every single avenue for ceasefires, for peace deals, for negotiations, every single avenue. If it wins, the Ukrainians have little leverage, the Russians have immense leverage, and they're able to get a lot of their terms, and they're continuing to ask crazy terms. So if they somehow get those terms, that's crazy terms where they could probably start the war again in 4 to 5 years. If they don't succeed and it falls through, then the Ukrainians are in a worse defensive position than they were before negotiations started, due to either the cutting off of aid, due to the suspension of American intelligence providing support, or the cutting off of American aid, the cutting off of any support that we're providing them, or the fact that we're just not preparing. And this is the thing that scares me the most, honestly, is by the time we realize that it's no longer smoke, it's no longer fire, the fire has now gotten it, just, there's not no fire on the street, fire's gotten into your home. And by the time we realize that, oh snap, you know, and when I say we, what I mean is the presidency, right? If this isn't the worst malice, there's some deal being cut behind the scenes and they're just letting it being dragged out, which is a nightmare scenario. But I mean, considering how incompetent this has been, my mind speculates. But let's say for a moment that they do care at least how this looks domestically a little bit. Morally corrupt. They do care that, you know, if the Ukrainians if another offensive happens, it's really going to hurt them. By the time that offensive happens, by the time this attack goes forward, we will not have passed any new aid deals. We will not have supported them with new shipments of artillery shells or mines or anything. Everything that's being sent over now is stuff that was previously approved by President Biden. Trump has done nothing to move new means to support Ukraine. Not excavators, nothing. And so when this comes to roost, what then? Are we going to scramble? Are we going to be left scrambling? Or are we going to say, well, they got us. I give up. But it's too late now. Now, look, Europe is trying to account for this vulnerability, this externality, this likely externality. So they're trying to get more support to Ukraine. I think that the Turks have good motivations to possibly try to put their foot on the lever. I don't know how much they will. I don't know. Foot on the lever. You put your hand on the lever. You know, put your foot on the tip your foot on the scale, right? Now, I don't know if they will, and if they do, how much in order to support the Ukrainians, but they do not want the Russians to take the Ukrainian coastline entirely. They don't want that. They don't want it because then the Russians will have more dominance in the Black Sea, which will then challenge their authority in the Black Sea. And so the Ukrainians act as a counterbalance to that. And so I think that while the Turks, you know, do have other issues they're dealing with right now domestically, and of course, they have other issues they're dealing with foreign policy-wise, they have motivation. They could step in. Who knows how much that'll make up the difference? But from Russia's perspective, Europe is scrambling. America has lost interest, and they've been able to stand up over 3 years when America had its eye on the ball. At least one eye, you know, something. So now that America's gone, the biggest provider of funds, and I mean, not funds to NATO, but, you know, the biggest spender of military gear and equipment and, you know, the big military superpower. Now that they're gone and they're out of the picture, if we drag this out, and Trump's made very clear he has no interest in dragging this out, we can play out the clock. We can play out the clock, divide their support base, and then keep the war going. Or reignite it at a later date under terms which would keep Ukraine undefended. This is the reality we need to adjust ourselves to. This is what the Russians are preparing for. They're preparing for that pathway, and whether that pathway is taken or not, 100%, I cannot say 100% because I'm not a fortune teller. What I can tell you is the Russians are preparing for that pathway. They're loading gear onto the trucks. They're loading men into the trucks. They're getting ready for that pathway, and I think it is one of the most likely pathways. And in fact, I would say it is the most likely pathway. It is a pathway that if we do not go down, I will honestly be surprised. I will be pleasantly surprised, but I will honestly be surprised because at this point, I feel like I'm watching a train and I'm sitting in front of it and I'm just waiting it to hit, waiting for it to hit me. Except the train is a gigantic war machine, and the me is a nation of millions upon millions of men, women, and children. By the way, Patches, thank you so much for this mic. Mic purchased by Patches. I don't know if they wanted me to say that, but they talked about it while I was on stream before, so I wanted to say that.